Hello and welcome to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. Some of you might remember that back in 2020 I did a special episode called Murder Minis, which brought together a collection of several short cases from the Victorian era. I'm pleased to bring you another batch of ghastly crimes from the 1800s, which on their own would be too short for an episode, but they're too intriguing not to share, so I've put 3 of them together. I call these penny dreadfuls, named after the serial printed stories that were popular during the 19th century in the UK, a bit like dime magazines in the US. Dick Turpin, Jack the Ripper, and Spring-Heeled Jack are all colourful examples of the kinds of stories that were popular in these publications, summoning up images of macabre mysteries, murders, mischief and mayhem, sometimes crossing the boundary between real and imagined, although the ones I'm presenting are very much true. I've carefully researched them using a combination of sources to be sure that the facts are accurate. So although these would have been somewhat sensationalised in the international police news at the time, which was known for printing sketches of high-profile crimes like an old-fashioned graphic novel, I've verified all the details from court transcripts and other sources. So I hope you enjoy these short cases, which, regardless of their age, are no less harrowing, and the victims no less important than those from more modern times. Mr. Holmes the Killer. 13 was unquestionably an unlucky number for young John Wilkins. He was 13 years old when he was murdered, and it happened on Friday 13th of March 1869. John had recently left school and got a job working on a farm in the quiet North Somerset village of Winscombe, 15 miles southwest of Bristol. His role was as a sort of living scarecrow, and he was paid to frighten birds away from Farmer Henry Hancock's newly sown cornfield, a low-paid job often given to young lads which was, by the standard of the times, less unpleasant and dangerous than many alternative careers. Had he known that he would meet a gruesome end on the farm, he might have decided to take a job in a factory instead. On that Friday morning, while John was busy scaring away crows, a tall young man wearing a blue coat suddenly sprung up behind him as if from nowhere, like a ghastly jack-in-the-box, and struck the young boy over the head with a heavy stick. While John lay bleeding in the cornfield, the man took out a large pocket knife and began sawing at his flesh, nearly severing his head from his body. Leaving the corpse of the 13-year-old in a copious pool of blood, the killer threw his weapons into a stream and washed the blood off his hands, before calmly walking to a nearby village called Banwell, where he knocked on the door of the local police sergeant to give himself up. The sergeant was out on duty, but his housekeeper, Mrs. Roynan, was at home and invited the man inside, apparently undaunted by his appearance and the fact that his clothes were splattered with blood. Over an incongruously civilised cup of tea, the man introduced himself as Mr. Alexander Holmes, son of ex-military man Colonel Holmes. They had previously lived in a manor house near the town of Bridgewater, but the Colonel had moved to Ireland 3 years ago. He had not taken his son with him, as Alexander was mentally unwell and suffered from fits. His father had considered putting him in an asylum, but settled for leaving him in the care of local farmer Edwin Godfrey, who looked after Alexander as well as he was able for the sum of 7 shillings a week. Alexander confessed that he had escaped from Godfrey's farm early that morning and went wandering up and down the country roads, specifically looking for someone to murder. He had been tempted to attack several people he passed, but when he saw John Wilkins in the field scaring crows, he knew that he had found his victim. Mrs. Roynan observed that Alexander spoke with an air of superiority, But despite this and his matter-of-fact explanations, he openly displayed signs of remorse and wept as he related his tale, saying that he wished his father had put him in an asylum after all, as it might have prevented his violent act. The only thing that surprised him was that he had only killed one person. He said, "I felt I must kill someone, and it is a great wonder to me how it is I have not killed more." Finally, the constable arrived home and put an end to the conversation, which was no doubt a relief to the housekeeper. Holmes was taken into custody and gave a formal statement explaining where he had left the body. Police officers found Wilkins's remains exactly where he said they would be, and we can only imagine how terrible it must have been to see the body of a bludgeoned and nearly decapitated boy in what had been, up to now, a peaceful rural village where offences were usually no more serious than the theft of farm equipment. The horror of the events didn't stop people coming to view the murder scene, however. Local people visited Farmer Hancock's field to marvel at the exact spot where John Wilkins had lost his life, which had been marked with a stake driven into the soil and adorned with tree branches, one of which had a leaflet pinned to it from a Bible tract society, which read, "Come to Jesus." It appeared that tragic young Wilkins had already done so, well before his time. His killer, however, was unlikely to be admitted through the pearly gates when he shuffled off the mortal coil, which police hoped would be sooner rather than later, and preferably at the end of a rope. The inquest was held on 16th of March at the Woodborough Inn, presided over by the coroner for North Somerset, Mr. Craddock. The facts were unarguable, and the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against Alexander Holmes. Holmes was sent to stand trial at the Taunton Assizes, but was acquitted on the grounds of insanity and was remanded to Broadmoor, where he remained for the rest of his life, dying 49 years later in January 1917. Somewhat unfairly, Farmer Godfrey was prosecuted for harbouring a dangerous lunatic without a licence and was deemed responsible for Alexander's actions. Unfortunately, the records don't show what happened to him as a result. Presumably, Colonel Holmes, sitting safely in Ireland, was not held accountable in any part for the actions of the son he left behind in Somerset. The Pantin Massacre. When French brush manufacturer John Kink was approached by a young man with a business proposition in 1869, he couldn't believe his luck. John had a wife and 6 children, and the idea of making more money was a tempting one, even if it involved criminal activity. John Baptiste Troutman was a 21-year-old career criminal who was known for his bad temper. He had once knocked his father down in an argument and was suspected of murdering a tramp simply because he felt like it, although he was never prosecuted. When Troutman explained his scheme, Kink was taken in hook, line and sinker. Troutman wanted to set up a counterfeiting operation, and he knew the perfect place to do it: the basement of a ruined country house in a remote location where the police were unlikely to come knocking. Kink was lost in thought as Troutman showed him around the basement, musing over how his already healthy bank balance could grow even more if their counterfeiting factory was successful. He owned 3 houses in the city of Roubaix, but he was ready to expand his wealth. As he congratulated Troutman for finding the perfect place to house their illegal outfit, the young entrepreneur poured some prussic acid into a bottle of wine and offered it to him. Kink took a sip, and the words of jubilation died on his lips. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, and was dead within moments. John Baptiste Troutman relieved Kink of his money and valuables, then buried him in the basement, having never had any intention of going into business with him. But his outrageous deception wasn't over. He penned a letter to Kink's wife asking her to send her husband some money, mentioning that he was writing on Kink's behalf as he was very busy working. Madame Kink was a trusting woman and saw no reason to question the note, so she sent her 16-year-old son Gustav to the address provided in the letter with an envelope full of money. Not content with the wad of banknotes, Troutman murdered Gustav too. The urge came over him to write another letter, this time inviting Madame Kink to meet him at the village called Pantin on the outskirts of Paris on 19th of September with more money. When she arrived at the agreed meeting point bearing 55,000 francs, it turned out that it wasn't just their cash Troutman wanted to steal. It was her life. Worst of all, Madame Kink had brought her other 5 children with her, apparently not having wondered where Gustav had got to. 13-year-old Emile, 10-year-old Henry, 8-year-old Akil, 7-year-old Alfred, and 2-year-old Marie. Troutman killed them all one by one. Madame Kink was stabbed in the neck with a long knife, and there was evidence of 30 other stab wounds in her body, inflicted long after she had died. 2 of the children had been stabbed and strangled, while the other 3 had had their skulls smashed with a pickaxe. Once his homicidal rage had passed, Troutman buried them in a shallow grave in the field, measuring 3 meters long and 50 centimeters deep. He then buried Gustav, who he had killed earlier, in the same field some distance away. Apparently, the only business Troutman was interested in was the business of murder. Having callously wiped out all 8 members of the Kink family, Troutman packed his bags and absconded, staying at a number of different hotels under an alias. He was heading for the port of Le Havre, where he planned to board a ship to America, and he knew an old woman there who could be relied upon to create fake passports. But in a stroke of bad luck, the police raided her home while he was there on 23rd of September and demanded to see his documents, so he made a break for it and leapt off a bridge into the churning sea below. Had the waves swallowed him up, it would have been a less ignominious end than the one he knew he would face if the French police caught him. But catch him they did, after dramatically plunging into the water after him. By now, the bodies of a woman and 5 children had been discovered in the shallow graves at Pantin by a farmer who followed a trail of blood and found a handkerchief sticking unnervingly up from his field. Brushing away some of the soil, he had been horrified to see a human face staring back at him. The police excavated the entire field and dug up body after body, until 7 corpses lay before them, each one heart-rendingly smaller than the last. They were soon identified as the Kink family. At first they suspected husband and father John Kink, as his body hadn't yet been discovered in the abandoned house. But when Troutman was captured and searched after making his break for freedom at Le Havre, the officers found that he was carrying ID papers on his person belonging to John, as well as the sum of 200 francs linking him to the sickening mass murder. Troutman spun them a yarn, claiming that John was the mastermind behind a plan to kill his own family because his wife had been unfaithful, and that he had bribed Troutman to help him with the promise of a passage to America. Nobody believed him, and word of the cold-blooded slaying spread across Europe, and he became the first French murderer to be featured by the international police news. Meanwhile, crowds of Parisians flocked to see the field where Madame Kink and her children had been slaughtered and buried. So many came to view the crime scene and trampled all over it that it couldn't be used for planting crops for a full 2 years afterwards. So who was this villain who so coldly executed an entire family one by one? Troutman was born in the Alsace region and had been spoilt by his mother as a young boy. He left school at 14 to work at his father's firm, Troutman and Camberley, mounting his father's patented spindles for cotton spinning machines. He was of above average intelligence, and his fascination with true crime was overshadowed only by his fixation with money. Despite his slight build, he was agile and strong, and one of his first explorations of violence was when he attacked his brother Edmund with a hammer, injuring but not killing him. He had first met kink when his father sent him to Roubaix to fit some machinery, and it was then that Troutman profiled him as a potential victim. After his arrest, a phrenologist examined the shape of Troutman's head and face, an old-fashioned pseudoscience that believed a person's physical features could predispose them to crime. In the court transcript, the doctor was quoted as saying, "Troutman's forehead is ample and singular in design, which suggests high intelligence. His upper lip is distrustful, which cannot be concealed even by his slight moustache. When he smiles, his teeth are white and pointy like a dog's, and his ears are symmetrical, which is usual for people of sound mind. His feet are flat-footed like an ape's." I'll include an image of Troutman in the blog on my website, which is interesting to see in view of the phrenologist's description. I'll put the link in the show notes. The trial began on 27th of December 1869. Each time he told the story, he seemed to invent new accomplices, and he now claimed to have 3 but refused to give their names. He was a cunning, greedy man who is unlikely to have wanted to share the money with anyone or put himself in a position where others held something over him, so he was probably lying for self-preservation to make it look as though he was less culpable than he was. As hard as it is to believe that someone could single-handedly murder 8 people in so brutal and bloody a manner, including children, we have every reason to believe he worked alone. While awaiting his fate, Troutman told his fellow inmates that he would rather commit suicide than be executed. But he didn't get the chance. On 19th of January 1870, John Baptiste Troutman was led to the guillotine in La Place de la Roquette, where, with a pull of a rope and the flash of a blade, his head was separated from his body with the same ease and efficiency with which he had taken the lives of the Kink family, and perhaps others before them. The mysterious letter. On 7th of January 1880, everything was perfectly normal in the Greenwood household. Richard Greenwood was a 70-year-old retired businessman who lived in a modest semi-detached house in Westbourne Grove, Harper Hay, a small town to the north of Manchester. Richard lived with his elderly wife Mary Ann, who suffered from ill health, and the pair were assisted by their 18-year-old live-in servant girl, Sarah Jane Roberts, who was originally from Wales. Sarah Jane had entered service at a young age and had done well with the Greenwoods, who treated her like a member of the family. She was friendly, cheerful and polite, with long, dark hair, and Richard Greenwood appreciated her hard work so much that he had even made provision for her in his will. On that particular day, it was around lunchtime when there was a knock on the door, and Sarah Jane went to open it. She recognised the man on the step as Mr. Cooper, the old business partner of Mr. Greenwood. He spotted a letter lying on the porch carpet and gave a jovial greeting, remarking, "Hello, Jane. Here's a love letter for you." She bent down to pick up the letter and noticed that it had no stamp, so it must have been slipped under the door by hand. She replied with a smile,
"Oh, no, it's for Mr. Greenwood."
At the next opportunity, she handed it to her employer and thought no more of it. That afternoon, Mr. Greenwood opened the letter. It read, "Mr. Greenwood, I would take the land near the coal yard behind the druggist's shop, Queen's Road. I will pay either monthly, quarterly or yearly, and will pay in advance, and will meet you tonight from 5 to 6 o'clock at the 3 Tons, corner of Churnet Street, and will tell you all the particulars. I don't know your address, or I would have posted it. Yours, W. Wilson, Oldham Road." Mr. Greenwood was taken aback, as he hadn't planned to sell the piece of land he owned in Queen's Road, and he didn't know anyone called Wilson. But his wife persuaded him to go to the 3 Tons pub to meet the potential buyer anyway, as the extra money would come in useful. He turned the contents of the letter over in his mind, wondering what the writer meant about not knowing his address. He assumed that perhaps Wilson knew which house the Greenwoods lived in by sight, but wasn't sure of the house number, so he had decided to hand deliver it rather than trust it to the postal system. Although he wondered, why hadn't he knocked on the door and asked to speak to him on the spot, rather than summon him so mysteriously to the 3 Tons at a time that Greenwood may or may not be available. But Greenwood was, in fact, available. So at 5 p.m, he left the house and walked over to the pub as requested. He waited patiently until 6:20 p.m, at which point he decided to leave, wondering if the letter writer had either changed his mind or got the day wrong. He left a message with the barman for Mr. Wilson in case he turned up later, advising him to visit him at home in Westbourne Grove if he still wanted to discuss the matter. Meanwhile, Mrs. Greenwood was sitting quietly in her bedroom at home. At 6:25 p.m, she heard a knock at the door downstairs, followed by Sarah Jane's footsteps as she hurried to open it. It sounded like she had let in someone with a light tread, which made Mrs. Greenwood imagine that it was a woman. She heard the kitchen door close. Then everything was quiet for a few minutes. Suddenly, a terrible scream split the air. Mrs. Greenwood limped out of her room as quickly as she could and called out from the hallway.
"What's the matter, Jane?"
But the only answer she received was a second gut-wrenching scream, followed by a deeply unsettling silence. Mrs. Greenwood hobbled down the stairs, crying out,
"Murder! Murder!"
The next-door neighbour, Mrs. Cadman, heard the screams and ran to the Greenwoods' front door, where Mrs. Greenwood told her in panic,
"There's something wrong in my kitchen."
The two women cautiously entered the kitchen together, where they were met with a distressing sight. Sarah Jane lay on the floor, blood trickling from her head. She was still breathing, but only just. The startled women called for a doctor, but the young servant never regained consciousness and died moments later. Mr. Greenwood returned home shortly afterwards at 6:40 p.m. and was greeted with the awful news. A surgeon named Mr. Pinder attended the scene and found that the cause of death was repeated heavy blows to the head with a blunt object. The killer must have taken the murder weapon away, as it was nowhere to be seen. Superintendent Bent arrived with a team of policemen and began examining the area and going door to door to interview the neighbours. A few yards away from the Greenwoods' home lived a school board officer named Mr. E.A. Halling, who reported hearing someone run past his front door and then splash through a clay pit across the road, which was full to the brim with almost 4 feet of water. He had then heard Mrs. Greenwood's cry of murder, at which point he picked up a metal poker and went over to the house to see if he could help. It sounded as though the murderer had escaped through the back door and waded through the wet clay pit, which would mean that he must have left footprints somewhere, and if they found a suspect, they might be able to inspect his boots to find traces of clay as evidence. Superintendent Bent was particularly interested in the letter from W. Wilson, which now looked like a deliberate ruse to lure Mr. Greenwood away, leaving Sarah Jane and Mary Ann alone and unprotected, although an assailant would surely not have thought that the 70-year-old man would have been able to offer much resistance anyway. Bent toyed with a couple of theories, wondering if Sarah Jane had planted the letter herself as part of a plan to covertly meet a lover or allow a burglar friend into the house. But Mr. Greenwood was adamant that Sarah Jane had always been loyal to them, and it was unthinkable that she would have been involved in anything like that. The post-mortem found that Sarah Jane was a virgin, and coupled with the fact that nothing had been stolen from the house, even a large sum of money in the room next to the kitchen, this effectively quashed both theories. But whatever had happened, it was clear that the killer was known to Sarah Jane, as she had willingly let him in and stayed with him in the kitchen for 5 minutes before the violence occurred. Mrs. Greenwood did concede that Sarah Jane received letters from young men, sometimes as many as 1 or 2 a day, but that she wasn't interested in any of them. The police found some correspondence amongst her belongings, but nothing of an amorous nature. Mrs. Greenwood later mentioned to the detectives that Sarah Jane had refused to take any leave owing to her over the last month, ostensibly because she didn't want to leave the house while her mistress was unwell. But could there be another reason? Perhaps she was being bothered by a particular man and didn't want to see him. Unable to get to her any other way, could her suitor have written the secretive letter to make it easier to gain access to the house and convince her to see him? The conversation could have become heated, and her disappointed paramour may have turned to violence. Mrs. Greenwood, however, was convinced that the visitor was a woman, but the power behind the blows suggested that she was mistaken. After the murder, Sarah Jane's sister was contacted and told to come to Manchester at once, but nobody told her the reason why. She found out in the most sudden and unpleasant way when she bought a newspaper at the station and read the headlines. After she had recovered from the shock, she told the police that Sarah Jane had written to her recently and mentioned that there were 2 men who wanted to court her, but she'd had no intention of encouraging either of them. A boy who helped the local milkman came forward to say that he saw 2 men loitering near the Greenwoods' home at about 6:20 p.m. on the night of the murder, and someone else reported seeing the same 2 men walking nearby on the Rochdale Road. A woman also observed a man meeting the description of one of them near Westbourne Grove on the afternoon of the same day. Although the jilted suitor theory seemed to have merit and the police scoured the local area and searched local lodging houses for the men that had been seen in the area, no arrests were made. The murder provided ample fodder for the local gossip mill to keep churning busily for the coming weeks and months. Some said that Mr. Greenwood had been having an affair with the beautiful young servant girl, and that this may have been a motive for murder, while others pointed a finger at his business partner, Mr. Cooper, and inexplicably at a milkman named Partington. But Mr. Greenwood's alibi was solid, as he had been at the 3 Tuns at the time waiting for the non-existent Mr. Wilson, and Partington was proved to have been on a milk round half a mile away. The police's efforts were hampered by a string of anonymous letters from people claiming to know the killer's identity, none of them offering any valuable leads. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown, and Sarah Jane Roberts was buried at Christ Church, Harperhay, just 3 days after her death. The Greenwoods, Sarah Jane's grief-stricken mother Elizabeth, her sister, her brothers and their wives were bereft and bewildered as they watched the coffin being lowered into the ground, the merciless chill of the January wind whipping around the cold grey churchyard. The inscription read, Sarah Jane Roberts, died 7th of January, aged 18 years. In Adam all die, and in Christ shall all be made alive. Richard Greenwood paid all the expenses for the funeral. Just before the coffin was closed for the final time, photographer James Mudd took a picture of Sarah Jane's eyes on the orders of Superintendent Bent, and magnifications were ordered. They believed that the last thing the victim saw might be imprinted on her eyeballs, which they hoped would be the image of the murderer leaning over her with a weapon. Unsurprisingly, this turned out to be useless, but it's intriguing to note that this was the earliest occasion in which eyeball photography was used in a British murder case, although it had been tried in Germany. The practice continued for several years and was attempted on at least one of Jack the Ripper's victims, but the belief soon died out and became nothing more than an old-fashioned murder mystery plot trope. Later in January, police received a report from a woman named Mrs. Sprague who ran a lodging house 280 miles away in Plymouth. She reported that two men had recently taken a room with her and said they had walked all the way from Manchester. She thought they were suspicious, and having read about the murder of Sarah Jane Roberts in the newspaper, she was concerned that she might be unintentionally harbouring the perpetrators. The two men had given their names as Robert Waite and Thomas Laycock, although Waite turned out to be an alias, and he was in fact a coal dealer by the name of Thomas Hales. The pair were planning to emigrate to Australia on a ship from Plymouth Harbour, and Hales had applied for passage under a false name, claiming to be unmarried. Clearly, he was planning to leave Mrs. Hales and his child behind while he sailed away for a new life on the opposite hemisphere. But this may not have been his only crime. Hales's handwriting bore similarities to the letter luring Mr. Greenwood to the 3 Tuns, and the landlady mentioned that she had washed some stained clothing for him, although she couldn't say for sure if they were bloodstains. Could Hales and Laycock have been the two men that Sarah Jane had written to her sister about, and the men whom people had seen wandering about near the crime scene? Hales may have also been acquainted with Mr. Greenwood's business partner, Mr. Cooper, but he had a strong alibi for the time of the murder, and although the police considered prosecuting him for lying on his application to travel to Australia, they released him without charge. A theory has emerged on the internet in recent years, purporting to originate from local Manchester historian Mary Turner, now deceased. Apparently, Turner believed that it was one of Sarah Jane Roberts' brothers who went to the Greenwood house that night and murdered his sister, and it is said that he was a police suspect at the time. Allegedly, there was a family legend that he had escaped to New York after killing someone, and a local rumour that he had once tried to buy some of Greenwood's land. This was denied at the inquest, and there is no evidence to support these claims. The case went quiet until February 1881, when soldier Edward Lynch of the 4th King's Own Regiment confessed to the murder while drunk, but later retracted his statement when he realised his foolishness. The following year, in June 1882, a man named William Nightingale Thomas, who lived in Manchester, made the same mistake and handed himself in for murder. Fortunately for him, the police realised that he wasn't to be trusted in his state of inebriation, and he couldn't even tell them the name of the victim. Even as late as 1890, there was another false confession, this time from a John Williams, who had been arrested in Chicago for another offence. Despite the number of people seemingly willing to take the blame for it, the real killer was never found. Mrs. Greenwood, whose health was already failing, died soon after the incident, and Mr. Greenwood left Harper Hay and went to live with friends. The Westbourne Grove house has long since crumbled away, and there remains little visible reminder of the violent act that took the life of an 18-year-old so many years ago, except for the monument to Sarah Jane Roberts that still stands in Christchurch Cemetery. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. There are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. The podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can support me on Patreon, make a one-off donation via PayPal, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support and I'll see you again soon.